J. Philip Thompson, Chris Boyd, Reverend. So like I said, today we have two of our distinguished commissioners here, as well as our general counsel. I'm going to pull this off. We have our general counsel. First, to my immediate, right next to me, we have Lurie Daniel Favors, who's a commissioner, as well as executive director for the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar College. Right next to Lurie, we have, yes, clap it up, clap it up. We have Joanne Yu, executive director for the Asian Federation. And then next to her, we have Melanie Ash, General Counsel for the Racial Justice Commission. Woo! So, what I want to start with, before we dive into some particulars about today's presentation, is that, and by the way, I'm Harold Miller, Executive Director for but what I want to acknowledge is that this Charter Commission was formed in the time when the city and the country is going through kind of a racial awakening. And not to say that there hasn't been other awakenings, not to say there's been continuous fights around racial equity. There certainly has. Many of us, all of us in this room, I'm assuming, have been involved in the movement for greater racial equity for many years. And then there's generations before us that have as well. But what we are embarking on is actually something slightly different. Is exactly looking at what can the city do, what can the city government do to address foundational structures in the city laws and governance, and how we can actually look at what we can do to address the racial inequities that exist, the inequalities that exist. Because remember, the city charter, the first iterations of the current city charter was written in 1895, 1896. But who were those who made those decisions back then? None of us here that looked at it here. It was mainly white men who, had their own thoughts about what government should look like and what structure should be in place to govern accordingly. And then over the years, charter revisions were tools to actually help government evolve and help government evolve into what we are today as a city. And so right now we have this commission that has the opportunity to further that progress of what our city looks like. So we are in we're in this midst of having a charter revision that in November of this year, New York City voters will be able to decide what the future of the city looks like when it comes to racial equity. And so our conversation this morning is centered around 3 ballot measures that voters will vote on. You'll hear from those who are in the room to help develop those ballot measures. We welcome questions. We welcome clarity if you need clarity. And at the end of the conversation, we're going to have a call to action, because we're going to need each and every one of you to make sure that your networks, your communities know about these ballot questions. Because what we want in November is for folks to go out and vote and make sure that they know what they're voting for. Too many times you have ballot questions and you flip it over and you read and you have no idea what they're talking about, no idea what it means, and no idea what's the impact on your life. And we want to change that. And so that's why we're going to embark in an aggressive campaign to educate as many New Yorkers as possible to make sure that every New Yorker who goes to the polls in November know what they're voting for. And we're going to need your help to achieve that. So we're going to discuss that as well during this conversation. So first, I want to just, come to our panel and just want to just thank you for participating. And two, I'll start with Lurie. Thank you for joining. And I want to just share with the folks in the room today about the mission of Racial Justice Commission and your role as a commissioner.
Question. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes? Okay. I can do this. Can you hear me okay now? Yeah. Okay. All right. Double layers, it matters. So really honored to have a chance to speak with you all this morning about the work of the commission. Our mission and our charge was to begin dismantling structural racism within the city charter. And I will admit, when I got the call about serving on the commission, I laughed because I thought, how are we going to really dismantle racism in the city charter? Because that charter, those hundreds of pages are really, in my mind, as someone who has been engaged in racial justice advocacy for a very long time, that charter was a legal document that really solidified how white supremacy was baked into our institutions as a city. And so our charge was to think about how to create not the solution to that, but to put the city on a pathway towards beginning the process of dismantling how structural racism was preventing non-white New Yorkers from being able to access an equitable distribution of resources and equitable opportunities to engage in decision-making processes. And so as a commissioner, our goal was really to translate the hours and hours and hours of testimony from people who showed up at hearings, people who submitted testimony. There were informational panels with subject matter experts, and there's actually a nice little chart on the website that shows how many of these engagements and points of contact we had. But basically, as commissioners, we were charged with taking all of the concerns that New Yorkers had and all the ways that they personally identified how racism and the institutionalization of white supremacy negatively impacted their life, and then translate it into something that we could all vote on. And that's really what those ballot proposals represent. So they're really the culmination of hearing from New Yorkers, recognizing that we could not solve racism in the 9 months that we had as a commission, but that we could lay a pathway that would put the city in a direction to where they would have to begin making choices that would bring us closer to a more racially equitable society. So as someone who has loved doing this work and had always done it from the outside, it was really an interesting and unique opportunity to participate in the process for thinking critically about how we could undo some of those long-held barriers. And I'm really excited that the proposals that we have, which I'm sure we're going to get to in just a bit, really do, I think, give New Yorkers an opportunity to think about how they want to see the city function. And so I'm just excited that we're going to be able to have an opportunity to vote on these proposals, and looking forward to fleshing out what they can entail momentarily.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Joanne, can you tell us how you feel your role has been on this commission?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. We are an independent commission. Like Lurie, when I got the call from Mayor, I was out walking and running errands, and I thought, what the heck, right? What the heck are we doing? I don't know what my job is, but okay, here we go, right? And it was at a time when our city really needed to have this conversation. For my community especially, this is when we were starting the challenge with all the anti-Asian hate. And so I'm watching my elders get beaten up on the street, and there's a lot of frustration, and I thought, if this is how I can serve my city and my community, as I always like to say, this is the hill I will die on. But I will say that it has been an honor to be on this commission, because we got to see and hear from New Yorkers that, to be honest, even as a community organizer, I will never get access to. And the things that they said, it was amazing. So much of it was heartbreak that afterwards I'd go home and cry, because it was so devastating to hear what people were saying. But we heard stories of how structural racism is not, it's literally tearing families apart and having people struggle with just day-to-day living. But also we heard these amazing testimonies from organizers. There was one session of Lurie and I said, oh my God, that was a master class in how do you organize a community. It's amazing, and there are so many wonderful leaders out there. And really for us, it was talk about how can we imagine a city that is really reflective of all of the New Yorkers there. It's not just this, the reality is that we all live very siloed lives, and our communities are very, very siloed, but how do we start to think about taking care of everybody, making sure everybody is valued and acknowledged, and everybody gets to thrive, and there are opportunities for us to continue to work together. And so that was a critical piece for me. And as an Asian American, I can stand up for other communities. I tell everybody, we're all capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. The two great things that we share in New York City is the subway, and everybody has to do laundry. And like, this is the world we live in. We have, this is really important because for us, all the things that we heard, it was really overwhelming. And I had pages and pages of notes, and it was overwhelming to hear what people were telling us. This is how I live, this is how I live, this is how our community is. And so it was really daunting to think about what's the structure we put in place to help alleviate that. And so the proposal that we have is to really figure out, we can't address affordable housing, this, but we can figure out how do we create a structure that gets to address all of these issues time and time again for generations to come. So it really, our plan is we're going to teach everybody, we're putting in a structure to teach people to fish versus giving them that fish for their hands. So that we are really proud of the work that we did together. And next is up to the voters, and we're going to really need everybody's help to make sure that the values that we all believe in together will become reality for us.
Thank you. Melanie, tell us about your role and about the work you have done as General Counsel for the Commission.
Yeah, thank you, Harold. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. So I was chosen to take a leave from my other job at the law department where I do litigation to be the General Counsel for the Racial Justice Commission. And obviously, that was a huge honor and a huge challenge. My charge was really to help translate the vision that the commissioners expressed based on their interaction with the community and based on their own very detailed and comprehensive discussions about what should racial justice look like in New York City. What would it look like if we could deliver racial justice? And my job was to take that and to translate it into the really nitty-gritty, the actual legislation that, if the voters approve these measures, the actual legislation that will go into the charter, the very words, language, the drafting of the ballot measures themselves to be clear and understandable by the average citizen, and then the abstracts, which is sort of the little description that goes along with the ballot measures themselves. So my work was really the nitty-gritty legalese, if you could call it that, as well as translating that into something that would be understandable by the average person. So a huge challenge, and I think with a team of people, not just me, I think we delivered what the commissioners wanted in terms of the actual changes that voters will see if they vote for these measures.
Thank you. So to the panel, I started a little bit about this, but let's touch a little bit more about the why. Why did RJC approach the charter revision by focusing on the root cause of structural racism?
So I think one of the challenges that all of us who have done work in this arena have seen in the past is that a lot of times our work is designed to ameliorate symptoms of racism. We encounter clients, we encounter constituents who have been dealing with some institution, some agency decision, some manifestation of the inequities that sort of shape the outcomes and the options for their lives. And so, as Commissioner Yu said, we couldn't say, okay, in housing, we want to do this, that, and the other. In sanitation, we want to do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, because we simply, one, didn't have the time or capacity, and two, the voters have to be able to understand what it is that we're doing, and it has to be able to make ready sense. And there's this concept that culture eats policy for lunch. You can change policies all you want, but if your culture is still one that is designed to uphold institutions of white supremacy and inequities, whether you are a willing participant or not, right? If your agency has a set of rules that we know produce racially disparate outcomes, but you as an agency employee are bound to enact those rules, you might recognize this is wrong and this is unjust, but the structure of this institution requires that even though we might have a policy towards fairness, that we are going to participate in ways that are going to replicate the inequities that we're very concerned about. And so our charge really became more about thinking about structural change that would be able to be replicated agencies, plural, wide, on a citywide basis. How are you going to approach racial inequities? What is your plan? What do you think you're doing well? What have you done in the past? What are the outcomes that you're currently achieving? And then you need to create a plan that's going to help you figure out, this is proposal number 2, that's going to help you figure out how you are going to ensure that the way your agency is currently operating is not going to continue to produce racially disparate outcomes. We weren't able to address all of the many instances. As Joanne mentioned, the folks who would come and testify, we had folks from the oath office who were talking about, I've been here for decades. I train people who are constantly promoted over me. And there's policies and procedures for me to talk about the inequitable hiring practices, but still, I have been here for decades and nothing is happening. So we realized that having individual addressing of scattershot issues was simply going to be ineffective and would replicate what happens when we treat symptoms and not the disease. These proposals are designed to get at the disease and to create a structure whereby the city will begin a pathway towards healing. And that, I think, was one of the reasons we really had to focus more on structural change and not just policy proclamations and pronouncements.
Sharon, want to add?
I'll say, the other commitment was to make sure that some of this had teeth, right? I mean, I worked on language access for New York City and New York State. And while it's law, it really, how do we know it's working? How do we know? How do we hold people accountable? So part of our work was, how do we put in a system that creates accountability? When you ask all of the city agencies, nobody says, I'm all about upholding structural racism. Nobody says that. They all believe in what we believe in. But how do we put something in place so that it gives them the ability to be able to start to figure out how to make their agencies work, to be able to address structural racism that is happening. And as Lurie said, some of those stories from individual New Yorkers, it was amazing. I mean, I hate this word resiliency because we're all, as communities of color, we're always told like you have to be resilient. But really, people have endured and they have carried on, and despite all of the obstacles, have fought their own amazing fights by themselves. And really is, now we acknowledge all of this is happening. How do we collectively work as a city to make sure that we put systems in place so nobody has to feel alone, and that there's some fight to what we're saying. If you don't follow these rules, there's going to be consequences, right? And there's going to be accountability. That's what our work was.
And I think I would just add, on a practical perspective, we recognized there were 1,001 things we wanted to try to address, and the commission was hearing that from people. We want you to address all of these things. But practically, we couldn't ask people to flip their ballot and have like 13 questions and have to go, that's just too much. So we had to do it in a way that was going to be translatable into two or three questions that people could read, understand, and vote on, but that would have an impact across the entire city in the way that Lurie and Joanne have described.
Well, thank you for sharing. So now I want to just kind of, pivot to structural racism itself. And how was structural racism defined? And what was the process to identify structural racism in the city charter?
I'll say a little bit about what we were thinking about going in. Obviously, it's a daunting topic to try to tackle. We started off trying to, ask New Yorkers, what do you think is affecting you? What is affecting you across the city? We heard from people, we heard from experts, on subject matter experts, who would talk to us about how it's affecting housing, how it's affecting wealth building, how it's affecting health care, how it's affecting everything like that. And then we tried to distill all that into sort of categories to make some sense of it. And we came up with sort of 6 structural inequities that we were seeing, patterns that we were seeing that were affecting people. One of them, for example, would be that there was an inequitable distribution of resources across neighborhoods. So in one neighborhood, their garbage pickup wasn't happening in the same way. They didn't have parks. They didn't have healthcare services. Their schools weren't functioning well. And that was happening in disadvantaged and under-resourced neighborhoods. So that was one thing we identified. We were saying, what are the structures that allowed that to happen? Some of the other, I'm trying to think of where some of the other structures.
The patterns?
Yeah.
Yeah, we had 6 patterns in equity that included, patterns of quality of living, patterns of,
marginalization and over-criminalization. Yeah.
inequity.
Inequity in wealth building.
Wealth building.
Inequity in quality services that promote social and emotional well-being. We heard a lot about the lack of mental health services. We heard lack of quality education, lack of support for early learning, scarcity of mental health resources. So, we saw all of these patterns, and so that was why we decided we needed to try to make sense of it all, come up with these patterns, and then try to see what could the commission design as policy, as changes, as possible amendments to the charter that would get at each of these things. So that's how we tackled the project. And we wanted to hear first from the community and go from the community up and not from us down to the community.
And I heard a couple of snickers when the first comment was, some communities are better funded than others. Shocking no one, right? But okay, what do we do with that? Like, what do we do with the fact that in Bed-Stuy, we have alternate side street parking 4 days out of the week, and in Park Slope they have it once? Like, what do we do about the fact that the train stations in my community smell like urine, and the train stations downtown Brooklyn and Upper East Side are beautiful with mosaics and well lit? Like, what do we do with the inequitable distribution of trash cans in our communities so that we don't even have access to maintain cleanliness and hygiene in a way? And so that's transportation, that's sanitation, housing, education, and these inequities existed in patterns all over the place. And so being able to again say every single agency in this city is going to have to now adhere to a process for determining, assessing what is the racial impact of what I'm doing? What is the racial impact of the structures that we currently have in place? And this is obviously only can happen if the voters vote on these ballot initiatives and decide that is what they want to see happen. But the idea of the racial impact statements, for example, and having the portion or the structure so that every agency is going to be evaluated to see not just what are your disparities. We don't need to know that you don't pick up trash in our communities the way you do in other people's communities. We know that, but what are you going to do about it in the next 2 years? And then in a year from now, we want to look back and see, well, how'd you do? Right? So it's not even just thinking about a snapshot of where we are, but it's then creating plans and opportunities to determine how you're going to do things differently. And then the voters and the residents of our city will then get to look back at your look back reports. Again, I'm getting into the specifics of the initiative, I'm sorry. But they'll be able to look back at it and then say, well, what did you do? You didn't really do such a good job. Transportation, my streets are still dirty, and my snow isn't getting picked up on a consistent enough basis. And so having the data and having access to that information is all a part of thinking about how our structures are either continuing to perpetuate these harms, or if they're actually doing their job and ameliorating some of them. So thinking about not just what structural racism looks like, but what would be a system, a counter structure, if you will, that would then force our existing patterns and pathways to adjust and to adopt new methodologies of engaging with the city.
And the hearings were held all over the city. I mean, the first one started in Staten Island, and I'm ashamed to admit that as being in New York for 25 years, it was the first time I was in Staten Island. And to hear the conversations, but also understanding all of the different New Yorkers who came out to testify, I think their eyes opened to say, oh my gosh, I thought this was just me worrying about this. All of the different communities thinking, oh, so everybody else is complaining about this? It gave affirmation to what everybody was understanding. And having people realize, oh, there's solidarity. Like, I thought I had these problems, and it was just me, and I'm complaining as an Asian American, XYZ. Other people are saying this too, from the Black, Latino, white community. There's a Muslim community, LGBTQ. Everybody's saying the same thing. Oh, there's solidarity here. I think we can work on this together. And it was amazing. It was so empowering to watch people's eyes open and realize there's a pathway that we have to work together, and we have to commit to, fighting together.
I think really briefly, there was also an educational component to this that was very informative. So when the third ballot measure looks at measuring the true cost of living, and this kind of gets to how structural racism shows up. So in our community, like the true cost of living says like a single parent with 2 kids, it would cost them around, $35,000. I'm fudging a bit on the numbers, but $35,000 or so to live a life of some quality in New York City. The actual cost for a parent and 2 kids is $92,000 to be able to live in a way that you are not, reaching the end of your check before you reach the end of your month. And think about the disparity there. to go from having a cost of living where your benefit packages, your access to resources in the city is measured at saying, well, with $35,000, you and your 2 kids should be fine. I have 2 children. I have a spouse, a co-parent in my household. I can guarantee you $35,000 is not enough for anybody to live meaningfully. And so being able to, like with the third ballot proposal, which asks, what is the true cost of living? And then how do we adjust our distribution of benefits based on that true cost of living? That's a structural issue. If your structure has a formula that says you can live according to X, but your reality says you need Y, we have to structurally undo that. And so thinking about that was really, again, one of the reasons why focusing on the systems and not necessarily the incidences of racism was really the driving force for the methodology behind our work.
Yeah, well said. Now, and just want to highlight, we talked about the 6 patterns in equity. We covered like 4 of them, but the 5th and 6th one talks about inequities in representation and decision making. And then number 6 is an enforcement and accountability of government and entities, which we found we lack of is that we have all these great ideas, but who's enforcing it? How's it get enforced? Whether or not it's ever enforced to begin with was something that we recognize we're lacking. So I just wanted to just highlight those last 2. When we talk about, those patterns and equities, shifting from those conversations that we had with New Yorkers over the last year, let's talk briefly about like how the commission decided on the 3 ballot measures: the statement of values, the establishment of an equity office planning commission, and the true cost of living that we just talked about. Like, how do we jump from those patterns and inequity to say, okay, here are the 3 ballot measures we're going to get to?
And I think we like to frame it as aspiration, action, and accountability. The 3 A's of these ballot measures. Aspiration is really about what is the city that we want to have? What do we deserve as New Yorkers? And then action, how do we move the ball forward? How do we move the needle towards that aspiration? And then how do we check ourselves, as Lurie said, how do we make sure that we're actually meeting our goals? And so the first one, do you want me to start talking about the first one, Harold?
Go for it.
So the first one is the statement of values, a preamble to put to the front of the charter, and that's the aspirational aspect. The commissioners were sort of stunned when they started. They got their giant charter, which is about this thick, hardbound copy, thousands of sections, and flipped it open to the first page, and there was nothing there tying the document together. It was sort of a cobbled together group of very important legislative documents to set up structures and establish the powers of the mayor, powers of the city council, how the elections should operate, all that kind of detail, all the nitty-gritty, but with no passion, with no vision, with no aspiration expressed in front of it. And so they said, let's, to the lawyers, can we put some kind of a vision statement at the front of it? Can we put a preamble the way that the Constitution has a preamble? Because the charter is the city's constitution. And so that's what the preamble is intended to be, a statement of unifying values that unite all New Yorkers across the kind of city we want to see. So for example, it has an acknowledgement of a land acknowledgement that the land that New York City sits on is traditional Lenape territory, which we thought was very important. It has an acknowledgement of slavery and the harm of slavery, of immigration discrimination, of I'm trying to think of my language. Look at my draft of it here. And by the way, there's some copies of the report outside that you can see the actual details and all the legislation. But it gets into what do we want for our city? We want a healthy city, a safe city. We want a sustainable environment. We want vibrant public spaces that welcome everyone. We want education that's quality, that's culturally sensitive. So it really just lays out how the commissioners and New Yorkers who spoke to us and told us what they wanted view and the aspiration for what our city should be about. And then it basically says that these are the values we want to be guiding city government as they carry out their duties. We want city government to say, when they're making decisions, when they're planning, when we're looking back to see if they've achieved their plans, do they speak to these values? Are these values being integrated into city government in the way that we operate? And it basically talks about, at the end, we the people of New York City, united in our resolve to build a just and equitable city for all, recognize the efforts of those New Yorkers, past and present, who fought for racial equity and social justice, honor the contributions of those New Yorkers who have suffered in the name of freedom, and acknowledge all who fought, struggled, and dreamed for a better life and a better city. Together, we stand on their shoulders as we move boldly towards a brighter tomorrow for ourselves, our children, and future generations. So that's the kind of values we want to put, that the commission wanted to put in front of the voters and let them decide if that's the city that they want to see.
And that guidance component is really important, because if there's a question, if I'm an agency head and there's a question about how a policy might impact a variety of communities, then that's my benchmark, right? That becomes the basis against which I can evaluate the direction that my decision making is taking our agency. So if the decision we want to make is going to be counter to that, well, then we can't do it because there's going to be repercussions, right? So it's important to and there's for those of you who are part of the Christian tradition. I grew up in a black church, and y'all know the phrase, without a vision, the people perish. So you gotta have a vision to say what it is you want, what it is you're striving for. Otherwise, you're just going to replicate what already is, which I think we can all agree, quite frankly, is not working. So it's a guiding statement, but it's also a benchmark against which you can consider, well, did transportation really do what, did the decision they make come in alignment with that, or did it take us farther away from that statement? So having that as a baseline really is going to be important for people to get a sense as to what are we striving for.
And you'll see the way this vision plays into the next proposal around the planning process, which I think we'll talk about soon.
Yeah, so let's dive into our plan, the action part. So ballot question 2 is a 3-in-1. We talk about the establishment of racial equity office, racial equity plans, and an establishment of commission on racial equity. And so let's get into the why and what that trifecta means, the potential impact on New Yorkers. We want to.
Sure. This is actually one of my favorite proposals. I love all the proposals. Just because as an individual, this is something I've been dreaming about. So, when I didn't believe it when I got the file. I was like, you lying. But the idea of having a racial equity office, plan, and a commission, that sort of gets back to the forward planning. Like, what is it that you're going to do differently? And then the look back report, how did we do in our effort? And then having an established body that sits independent of the other agencies. I think of it kind of like, in my own mind, it's like an omnibus group. And it's a body that's going to look at how agencies are engaging in the process of developing their racial equity plans, evaluating whether or not they did a good enough job, what areas do they need support. And let's be honest, after the George Floyd and protests that came about after the videotape of him and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, it was clear that we needed a lot of things to happen. This wasn't the first time that we've had that sort of reckoning, but we realized that a lot of things needed to happen. But everybody, I don't know if you noticed that at the same time, corporate entities began hiring DEI folks. It was like, everybody got a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. You get an officer, you get an officer. And that's great. But if you don't really have a body an evaluation and a set of expertise, so that just because you might have been working at the clerk's office and then you got the call, hey, we also going to need you to focus on DEI. We have this new racial justice equity thing that we got to do. We're going to add this to your list of things to accomplish. Doesn't mean you're an expert at it. You may have never thought about these things ever in life, but it's a position that had to be filled. We got appointed to it. So the idea is recognizing that not every single agency is going to have experts within it. And so we're going to need to have a system for evaluating how we are doing as a city, so that every agency isn't in isolation, but they're working together.
So let's just break down the 3 pieces so you can hear a little bit more about what they are. So the first one is to create government, not one little office over there in the corner. One person does a job and they're responsible just to make a report. They want every agency to be engaged in racial equity planning, looking at all of the issues that they face. And it's also timed to sit alongside the budget process. So when you're drafting your budget, you're drafting your racial equity plan, so that they will influence each other. There will be the opportunity for you to say, well, okay, we want to do this, now let's make sure our budget's for that, right? That's right. And then you also have to, it also has a measure in there to do some tracking of statistics. So what is the indicator that's going to show if we're achieving racial equity in transportation? So there will be equal, maybe the indicator would be, does every community have the same access to public transit? I don't know. So then 2 years later, how do we do? So you can actually track it by statistics, communities broken down. And so the final prong that Louise mentioned is the commission, which is an outside of city government, community-driven commission made up of community members who are focused on racial equity or who have experienced working in racial equity. The goal is to get voices that are not normally at the table to have a say. So among the people that we'll be looking to get on those commissions will be people who've never served on city government, never been in a commission, people who have lived experience with racial equity, people who live in public housing, people who are service users, young people below 25, LGBTQ trans people. Some of the nitty-gritty of the details of the three proposals.
And what's exciting is that there's an office set up to always do a scan. You know, everything is going to be, things change all the time, and there's going to be new communities, new populations that we could think about. All the communities we've listed, we also have the disability, disabled community. How do we serve them? How do we make sure that they're taken care of? So I think it's definitely not just like, here are the three groups that we want to serve. It is always an office that's going to always look out and say, as we that I kind of push, like language access, about cultural expertise, about when we have city contracts going out, how do we make sure that all of the groups that have always served our communities, with cultural expertise, language expertise, that basically hold up their corner of their neighborhood, they're recognized and they're not competing, and most of our groups are small. And how are they not competing with these mega agencies, right, that have all of the resources? How do we give everybody a fair shot to be able to serve their community? For my community, I know that some of the things, I'm up here because I'm trying to figure out this language access bill that we have. And, in New York City, the fastest growing community, Asians, African immigrants, and we also have native Mexicans the Mexican community that they don't speak Spanish. They speak indigenous languages. We need to think about how are these languages included? How do we give people information they need? And for sure, languages, when you look at what happened during Hurricane Ida, and you look at who died, Asian Americans. And when we said, why didn't you leave your basement apartment? They said, because we never got an alert in my language. And so people died in their basement apartments. They drowned to death. And, all it was a simple little warning, beep, beep, beep. If you're living in a basement apartment, get out. But, nobody thought of that. So here's the mechanism that we need to start to think about.
And you mentioned disaggregation of data and coming out of and when we were looking for data on African immigrant communities, what we found was data that said African. And I'm like, seriously? Do you know how many countries? I don't need continental-wide data. I need specificity. When you think about Asian communities, there's Hmong, Laotian, Japanese, Korean. Like, there's all these varieties, but you know what you often see? Asian. And that it creates this whole reality where we're not able to really drill down and hyper-localize on the needs of specific communities. What's happening in the Jamaican community might be very similar to what's happening in the Asian community, but there are going to be perhaps some distinctions that we need to take into account when we're engaging in city planning. So not just having data that says black, but having data that is disaggregated and that is looking at with more specificity at different communities is going to be super helpful, and not just in another couple of years when we get back to census again, but it's going to be super helpful in every stage of city planning and thinking about how resources are going to be distributed and what are the processes that we need to structure that distribution so that we're hitting communities in a way that they can actually receive.
Yeah, and I just want to add as a point to the racial equity office is that a lot of times when city agencies put out policy, they have a couple of things they consider. Very, very few things they consider. They consider the budgetary cost of it, the political calculations of the policy, and more recently the environmental impact. And now, what this office actually adds to it is what's the racial impact? Will it be beneficial? Will it be disparate? And that is very important because a lot of things that are decided upon in our city government does not take into effect what's the racial impact. And so this office will actually start to have that lens towards what are the racial impacts of this initiative, this policy, this legislation that we want to propose to city council. And so that's, I think that's a game changer because right now we decide on money, politics, and sometimes the environment, and that's how most things are considered when you're looking at policies in the city today. So I want to go into the accountability measures. We started to talk about it a few minutes earlier about true cost of living standards. I want to unpack that a little bit more because this is this cost of standard is not just to see how much you need not to be poor. There's a difference between living with dignity and what not to be poor. And so, Joanna, let's unpack that a little bit more. Like, what are we looking for? What we want to do? What kind of information we want to get out of that?
Sure. Yesterday when I was coming up here, I was on the train and I was flipping through all the emails and the news items, and they were talking about how the cost of housing in Manhattan, right, compared to Iowa, right? in Iowa for $1,500, you can like, basically buy an entire town, right? In New York City, you can get 250 square feet or something like that. And I was like, this is exactly what we're talking about. The true cost to live in New York City with any kind of comfort, right? This is not like, you're living on Park Avenue, but any kind of comfort. We don't have to worry about, trading this for that just to be able to make ends meet. What does that look like? This is what this work is. And I'll tell you, for the Asian American community, with my experience, everybody says, oh my gosh, Asian Americans are so rich, crazy rich Asians, right? I've been to senior centers where seniors have to bring a plastic container on Fridays because they have to save half their lunch to be able to get through the weekend. This is the real story of poverty. For our communities where rapid gentrification is happening, we are now lumped in with rich neighborhoods. I did community development in Chinatown for 10 years. And we were writing proposals. It was like, I would always say, like, why are we lumped in with Tribeca and Lolita and Soho? Because that's how they drew the guidelines, right? But it was like, our community folks are poor. I've been to, I have worked on things and children living here, and in order to fit them in, all the people in, they attach like a wooden plywood box to the roof, to the ceiling, so that other people can live in. This is poverty. This is unseen poverty, and that nobody's living with dignity. They can't, I've seen people live in shift beds. You work in a restaurant, you're gonna live here for 12 hours. So if you can't, if it's not your time to sleep in the bed, you're gonna have to go sit out in the park. This is no way to live. We cannot let our fellow New Yorkers live this way. We know it's expensive to live in New York. We need to measure the true cost of living. We need to be able to say, this is how much it really does take to live here. It is, the subway, everything costs money. The minute you walk out the door, you better start taking your dollar bills out, right? Everything costs money. This is what we are thinking about. How much does it really cost? How do we start to think about pay equity? How do we think about, making sure, everybody has enough to live. We're not, we're not saying like everybody's gonna get a penthouse apartment, but it's like, how do you get to live in your neighborhood? How do you get to save for the future? How do you get to think about wealth building? Because when we talk about wealth building, most of the folks in our community are like, what are you talking about, right? Like, I barely get through the week with what I have. Those are the conversations that we need to put out, because we need to have some standards about making sure that people who live in our city have enough to live with dignity, and so that nobody is, we always come from a place of need. It's a scarcity mentality, and we need to be able to elevate this conversation so that we don't have that anymore.
And I think the specifics are really that the city doesn't currently measure what is the true cost of living in the city. We operate under the federal poverty line, or sometimes there's a New York City version that has a slightly different, that is a little bit more effective at measuring. But reality is, $26,000 or $30,000 for a family of four is well below poverty. It's not even survival. So we need to actually start the process of changing the conversation by actually tracking what does it really cost in real dollars to live in New York City. And then policymakers and advocates and labor unions can use that number to kind of say, this is what is it?
And just, I need to amend a number that I'd given out earlier. I said a parent and 2 children, $35,000. I misread my notes. It's actually a family of 4. And it's We won't be settling for fighting for things that aren't going to actually move the needle. It will inform how we advocate, and it will inform how we consider what actually makes sense in terms of what our organization should be fighting for. So identifying it and getting the data is a very important first step. But this whole thing is about very important first steps, because remember, we both started by saying we got the you're like, you gonna solve racism in 6 months? Come on now, you playing. So it's not that any of these ballot measures, and remember, none of this that we talked about, as hyped as I am about these things, none of this happens unless New York City voters vote on it in a way that reflects that that's what they want to happen. So this right now, this education component, it feels real good to have this conversation. Come November 8th, there's a decision that has to be made. And that decision is, even if these measures were to be affirmatively upheld and voted into being by the voters, it's just the beginning. We ain't solving white supremacy with our 3 lovely little ballot initiatives. Yeah. It's going to be that magic token.
And you can tell that Lurie and I both work on, we both work on the census, but we're also data people, and we also think about civic engagement, right? We've created a framework. Here's what we're giving you, right? Now it's up to New Yorkers. When you vote on this, and if the New Yorkers agree with us and say these are the priorities, it's up to you, right? You need to, now you have the tools to figure out what the next steps are. Trust us that we'll be right beside you. Because we can also sit on the other side of all of this, right? But it is a beginning of a conversation, and all good conversations that have impact start with data, right? You can't just go and say, we have poor people. Okay, nobody's gonna buy that. If we say, look at all these people who live below the poverty line. This is what it takes to live in New York City. That's what
and I think it's an important first step in terms of having the concrete data. But I can't help but believe that the people who make decisions right now are already aware that the number of, maybe they don't have the exact number, but they know that that federal poverty level is not applicable in New York, but they continue to make policies based on that. So I'm just concerned, I guess, in a way, or that we will have a number, but we will still be in the same boat where policies will be based. They'll just continue anyway, doing whatever they're doing.
That's right. The accountability piece. What does it mean? How do we hold government accountable? And that part of that is in the data, is in putting it out there and making it known, casting light on it. Part of it is in the planning process. Every 2 years, they've got to go back into their racial equity plan and say, how are we getting at all these inequities? Every agency. And the commission is going to be this citizen body, basically, New Yorkers who are going to say, like, listen, that's not working for us. You need to, and they're actually continuing reporting. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's all going to be about how are we holding them accountable? How much do they actually do? But also making it available to people besides government. If government knows the real number but never reports it, keeps it quiet under the table, then it's not available to the advocates, to the labor negotiators. To community members, to new legislators who want to come in and shake things up with a new vision. So I think it's about making the information available to be used and to be held accountable.
And quickly to your point, one of the three, remember in the beginning we said that even if I don't agree with the decisions that my agency is making that are going to replicate inequities, I kind of have to do it because I'm bound by it. Having the data and the information coupled with that body creates a different structure. So then it can't just be, well, we're just
their findings and their statement of values? Like, is that like the police department and other things like that, or is it just like certain agencies that would have to report it?
This is citywide.
The report, the racial equity plan will have to be created by every city agency, every mayoral agency, and including the police department every 2 years, and then there will be a citywide one that then incorporates all of the different racial equity plans. So yes, it's something they were required to report out on. What are they planning to do, and how did they do on the last plan that they 2 years later, like, did you achieve it? Have you moved the needle towards it, or did you totally fail?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to Karen's point about the data and what impact it can have. Of course, the powers that be know this information, but us little people on the ground don't. The amount of times I've been to a community board meeting and people don't know that it's the federal standard, which is a joke, living in New York City with regards to public housing, that they think that that's going to be something that people can aspire to and actually afford to live. And so, just like through ranked choice voting and the voting rights movements that we're doing, this whole process is starting from the ground. And when people have the information, they have power in their And that is how we're gonna move the ball. I understand your concern, but I just wanted to put that, like, we gotta shift the balance of power here, remember that we're in charge.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, I agree with that, with shifting the power. I'm from Rochester, New York, and we need something like this. We need something like this nationwide. Nationwide. Last minute, they changed poll sites. Last minute, there was, of course, no communication out to the constituents. And then they stuck us into a room. And guess what happened? A ballot wasn't there. The ballot for this specific race wasn't available.
Wow.
So when we asked a question, we were calling BOE. I actually went on as far as posting something on social media to say, can you believe this is happening? And here it is, in my inbox was my county legislator telling me to take that shit down. He said, just like, so, I started pulling back the layers to say, why is this happening? I'm calling Board of Elections. I get a call back at 7 o'clock saying, hey, I understand there's an issue. Close at 9.
Yeah.
So you start asking these questions to say, why is this happening? I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning taking elderly back and forth to the poll site. That's a little bit of over 1.5 miles, and in the area with high traffic. So we know what's going to happen at it. They're going to be afraid to travel there, and when they get there, the second they hear you're either at the wrong poll site or that ballot isn't here, they walk off, right? Because our people continue hearing no. Guess what happens? It's going to discourage their action at a poll site. Now, I'm a boxing promoter by trade, but this caused so much. Yeah, so I'm going to fight it.
There you go.
This pushed me to a point where I ran for office. That gentleman that was in my inbox, I told him, I'm going to take your seat, and I did just that. Our communities go into poll sites, and Latinos often have 2 last names. They were made fun of, they were pushed, they were taunted. So guess what? They're running out the door. So, rights lawyer, please let me know, because these people really need to fight what's happened here. And it's accepted. We go to Board of Elections where, I push things to say we have to have an honest conversation. We could talk about the injustice, but if we don't stop and fight, it's going to continue. So I celebrate this. I want this to be replicated all throughout the state, our country, because that is our right. Yes, I'm a county
So let's find some time to talk and learn about what we have done here in New York City. And
yes, I want to
let's
replicate it.
see if we can replicate it in other cities like Rochester.
Just as a point of privilege, really quickly, at the Center for Law and Social Justice, we're actually launching an advocacy academy on April. There is a minimal cost. It's just to cover the books and the materials, and we have one of the graduates of the program here. So if you visit our website, we have a program that is designed to help the people figure out how to do exactly what she's talking about.
Thank you. Wow. First, Lurie, you're amazing. Yeah, everybody. Sorry. Lurie's a comrade. But really, my question was kind of taken up by these 2 ladies as well. But my question was around. We mentioned earlier that you're really shifting the power dynamics, and you want the people to kind of leverage and have access to the information we have to take as part of the commission. I wanted to hear more, and I know Lurie's working on that with other local groups in the city. community members to stay engaged in the process. As we know, there's so many different areas and target issues when it comes to voting in general.
Yeah, I mean, we as the commission, I mean, maybe Harold, you can speak to this. We're planning to launch an education campaign, and much more. This is sort of the beginning of it. We're coming to these opportunities, but we are going to be going. There'll be media. Yeah, there'll be, more events, but, it's not my area of expertise. I'm like the nitty-gritty law stuff. And Harold could probably speak to that here a little bit.
Yeah, Melanie, make sure I don't break any laws, and I'm the organizer. So look, for us, we are kicking off our education campaign this later on in the spring into the summer. Once we get past the primaries, you're going to see a lot more from the RJC in terms of how we're going to actually educate New Yorkers. We're actually going to need every single person in this room to help us get that. We're a team of 5 right now with 11 commissioners, but we want to make sure we educate 5.5 million New Yorkers by November 8th. And so we're going to need everyone to host a meeting, participate in days of action, meaning handing out flyers, talking to folks on the subway, making sure that when you're in spaces and you're talking about the elections coming up in November, you're like, make sure you flip that ballot. And this is the questions. That's why we spend so much time making sure that everyone knows exactly what the intentions of these ballot questions mean, because we need you to actually articulate that to the New Yorkers that may not hear from us directly. They may see a commercial, they may hear us on Here and Now or inside City Hall at some point, but you really get insight on exactly what the intentions of the ballot measures are and what the impact is on communities moving forward. And so we need you to be the ambassadors to educate folks. Whether or not you agree or disagree with the 3 questions, we ask everyone to let folks know there are 3 ballot questions in New York City November election, and here's what the impact is on those 3 questions. And even if you disagree with it, talk to your neighbors about it, talk to your communities about it, work with us to actually host meetings so we can discuss it, to decide whether or not how we move forward with racial equity in the city. And so with that, I just thank everyone for participating in today's workshop. I want to give a shout out to the other members of the
Sure, yeah.